at home since you missed it. I'm Karen King. I'm the Director of Community Affairs for the Office of New Haven Affairs. Thank you for coming to our monthly breakfast. We host these on the first Thursday of the month, except for this month due to the holiday. We have an exciting speaker today. And before we get started, I just want to bring your attention to a few actually thank yous. So the Peabody Museum opens at 10 a.m. They had a ton of staff come in at like 5 in the morning. So I want to give a thank you to. So we have David Skelly, who is the director of the Peabody Museum, is joining us here. Hi, David. He's famous. He is. Madison Willauer and Bill are out in the lobby there. They're making sure that we're set up well and happy here. And then we have Andrea Amato, your director of programs?
Assistant Director of Education and Outreach.
So. And Andrea has arranged for us all to be able to visit the first floor after the breakfast. So please stay, hang out. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that. So we have a lot going on today, this month. We do have a few flyers up at my desk over here. The Beinecke Library is having something in honor of MLK on the 19th. We're gonna put information in the chat. Lots of great stuff. So we're gonna come over and visit me. And my colleague Jennifer Mello will add information in the chat as well. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jennifer to introduce our speaker. Jennifer.
Good morning. Thank you, Karen. So I have the pleasure of presenting Dr. Jessica Thompson. Dr. Jessica Thompson is an assistant professor of anthropology at Yale University and assistant curator of anthropology at the Yale Peabody Museum. For those of you who are in person, you have the pleasure of being there today. She is also a research affiliate of the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University, where she received her PhD in 2008. As a specialist in human evolution, Dr. Thompson has dedicated her career to understanding what makes people special compared to other animals, including our own ancestors and other close relatives. She studies how Africa was more than simply a cradle of humankind. It was also the earliest training ground where early modern humans first realized their potential as the technologically and culturally sophisticated species we are today. She has done fieldwork on the archaeological records of South Africa, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Malawi, and has a particular interest in the significance of Southern Central Africa for understanding the emergence of modern humanity. Her teams have recovered some of the oldest ancient human DNA in all of Africa, as well as rich collections of artifacts that tell the stories of past lives. She works with and learns from local communities about how to best conserve and display these collections at local heritage centers. Please join me in the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jessica Thompson.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Right here? Okay, so I have some hearing loss and I've got hearing aids, so I project and I don't always know how loud I am. So if I'm too loud, you can also tell me that. But I also know from experience that what it feels like to be that person in the back who doesn't actually hear what's going on. So I tend to be loud, but let me know if you need me to speak up or down or whatever. You're gonna help me out here. So who am I? Oh no, the Google Slides thing has put my eye down. All right, well, you might, this could happen throughout. I haven't actually gone through all of them. Well, I'm me, and I'm also kind of fill all of these various roles. My younger self, especially, these are kind of various field sorts of identities that I've had. I do experimental work. Believe it or not, that's an experiment where I'm breaking open some like goat bones out in the Serengeti as part of a study to work out like what happens when humans discard meals and then like carnivores come and scavenge after them. I do everything from that to being the person with the stick standing in the hole, instructing a whole bunch of, in this case, Australian and Malawian field school students in a field site. And, basically a lot of these kinds of things that you might imagine an archaeologist doing, I've done. But primarily my interest is on early human origins. And I have a lot of different topics that I cover and think about and do and have worked on and published about. So I didn't really know quite which one to focus on here, but I thought I would let maybe the people in the room guide the conversation. So I'm going to give you like 10 slides just to introduce some background to some of the stuff that we've done, and then basically let you choose your topic after that. And I have some like supporting slides if we need any more details. So there's a whole presentation here if we need it, but if we just want to make most of it Q&A, then we can make most of it Q&A. That's the idea. All right. So as somebody who studies human origins, I suppose most people think of this as the main question that we would concern ourselves with, the kind of like, well, where did we come from? Backwards looking part of it. But we would also like to know something about the ways in which humans have changed, the ways in which human ancestors have changed. And then after becoming someone who you would recognize as a person, was there something else going on in terms of changes that might be taking place less visibly? So a lot of people, when they hear human evolution, they're thinking about something like this, maybe not the last part, but they're thinking about this, you know, and then they're like, all right, well, you know, we kind of maybe used to look like this and now we look different. But what about after humans look like humans? You know, they had the body plan, they had the face, they had everything that you would recognize. And if they were on a subway today, you would never think of them as anything other than just a person, another person. But at what point in time did somebody who looked like that begin to develop that sort of modern brain, right? The modern mentality, the social organization that we would think about as making humans different in some really important ways from other species. And this is an ongoing argument between anthropologists who study humans and everyone else who studies everything else, because, you know, everyone wants their organism to be special in some way. But I really do think that humans have some capacities to do things and have a demonstrated degree to which they have like altered their own world that is just different from the scale at which other organisms, any singular other organism has done that. So I don't mean to say humans are special, like we necessarily need a standing, I don't know, round of applause or something. I just mean that there are things that we've done that really are quite different in terms of like the way in which we've been able to influence the other world around us. So, all right, going from that, I think this is the unexpected piece, like maybe we're not thinking about people who study the past as having that much relevance for trying to understand the future, but I do worry sometimes about like how useful is it to actually know something about the past, and like what's my larger relevance in this world. People are interested, and I'm glad you're all here because that shows people are interested, and that's really important. But like, is there something we could do more practically based on our understanding of what came before to maybe help us look ahead in a useful way? So, you know, if you want to know about some of the stuff I've talked about with respect to the way humans modify their environments, the way that we kind of interact with other organisms, and like the really, really long history that we've had doing that, you can look this stuff up. You know, I can send it to you, and you can always put these links out if people are interested. I have a website, and I'm very easy to find, and all of that's there too. So if you're more of a YouTube consumer, or maybe you've got, I don't know, young people in your lives who have probably never going to read anything, but will watch it, then you could refer them here, I guess. Right, so I always start all my talks with this picture, which was just a photo that I took because I was just walking around in my field area in Malawi, which is in southern Central Africa, and I'll show you some maps. But I was walking around, and then I just turned around, and there it was, right? I just had this beautiful sunset, and I had this not great camera, but I took this photo that has kind of ended up being the iconic photo that I use for a lot of talks, because it really just shows a lot of things here. You've got this striking landscape, like the natural landscape, but then you have all this other activity happening in the foreground that maybe is not the first thing you notice about the picture. But what it shows is that this is a heavily, what we would say, anthropogenic landscape. So this is a place where people, the anthro part of it, and the genic, like people have grown that landscape, they've developed that landscape, they've changed and altered that landscape. And then all of these things are kind of connected to each other, the natural piece, the human piece. And there might be a very, very long history of humans doing this. Like we think of, well, I don't know, can someone in this room maybe just give me an idea? If I say how humans change like their landscape or how humans change the world around them, what's like the first thing that pops into your mind about when that might have started to happen?
Farming.
Yeah, farming. Farming is the one people usually come to. They're like, oh yeah. No, there aren't other animals that farm at the kind of like large scale that we do. There's like ants that sort of do this and fungi and stuff, but like people out there with their animals, with their plows, right? They're really making a big change. They're cutting down trees. They're using fire to remove vegetation. Like they're really shaping that world. And what we can do is we can actually step back long before farming and see a lot of evidence that humans were already having a pretty significant impact, even when they were just gathering their food from the land and they weren't actually engaging in farming. They were already doing things and tweaking their environment in ways that made it more productive for themselves. And that's been really helpful for us as a species because it means we can use more of the landscape. It means that we can make more people, but then we have a problem, right? Because then we got to use more of the landscape. But then now that we can get more out of that same environment, we make more people, right? And we just keep going like this. And yeah, I think you can see that this is a trend that we're continuing, right? The more we extract, the more people we can make because we can get more out of that same environment. And then there's more people that need resources. So we innovate our way into extracting more resources. And then this kind of cycles forward. So where we're going with this is sort of the topic of science fiction, but also it's the reality of the world that we're living in right now. So hopefully that's some of the ways in which kind of just even looking at a simple picture and seeing how no landscape is really ever that pristine, you'll start to pick out that there's always people in the picture somehow. Anyway, I also start a lot of my talks with like a nod to this fellow. This is, I think I have a pointer here. Oh, that's like. All right, I won't use that much, but this was, some of you who know something about human origins might have heard of Louis Leakey, who's the other guy in the photo. And Louis Leakey was, his lesser known role was encouraging people like Jane Goodall, who just got the Presidential Medal for her study of chimpanzees. Jane Goodall was actually, had Louis Leakey as a mentor because he wanted to know about human origins. And he was like, well, we can't really know that much about our own evolution if we don't know more about like other species that are really closely related to us. So he assembled his academic crew and he had some grad students and he said, all right, Jane, go study the chimps. And then Dion Fossey, you might have heard of her studying the gorillas. She was also a part of that group. Galdikas was the one who went to study orangutans. So they all went off and did their field work and then they became kind of known in their own fields of study. And Louis Leakey is best known for his research on fossils. And J. Desmond Clark was another person who was kind of in that same era. And he was most well known for studying like the cultural artifacts that people left behind. But one of the things that I want to point out with this is kind of actually a little bit of a critique. So J. Desmond Clark was my PhD advisor's PhD advisor. So he's like my academic grandpa, but actually I never met him because he was quite elderly by the time I started my PhD. So he was, I think he was something like 90 years old when he stopped doing, field work. And then, there was kind of a decline thereafter. So I never did have a chance to meet him, unfortunately. But he's part of this narrative I'm going to call like the lone heroes narrative. So whenever you see these documentaries about human origins, there's always like this guy and he's standing there usually with a hat, and he's like boldly surveying this landscape as if it's this empty landscape, right? Where there's no one else around. It's just him in the desert or wherever he is. And he's going to make the big discovery of whatever, the year. And I kind of want to push against that narrative a little bit because actually all of this discovering that people have done over the years has always been with teams. It's always been with the help of local communities. They just haven't always gotten the acknowledgement for their role in that in the same way. So, kind of a, what's the word? Like a mixed relationship, I suppose, with that legacy. And I know I'm a part of that legacy too. So I got to try to think about how we can maybe do a little bit better. He also published this paper in the Society of Malawi Journal. Nyasaland was the colonial word for the country that is now Malawi. And he called it the Cinderella of Central African prehistory. And that's because he had gone there, he had visited, and in the manner of his day, he spent like 2 weeks and decided he knew everything about the whole area. I mean, that's kind of an exaggeration, but really in those days, what they would do is they would show up, they'd have some colonial contact, right, in the colonial government. They would show up, these researchers from various countries, and they would say, have you seen anything? Do you know about anything, any important, interesting sites? And they would take them there, and then they would just dig big holes, and they would do it very rapidly, and they would pick through it and find all the stuff that they thought was the most important stuff and throw the rest away because they figured in their professional opinion, it wasn't ever going to be that useful. And then they would carry those things that they had picked out and they would put them in some museum somewhere, or they would split them up. And then some of the collection would end up in Britain and some would end up in South Africa in the case of Malawi, some would end up in Boston. I mean, this stuff ended up everywhere. And, you know, the result is that the people of Malawi have now a pretty fragmented, you know, set of history with respect to their own history, that they've got to take the effort now to go back and track down and find and figure out where it is and what's there. So I'm hoping that as a part of my own research interest in that area, I can kind of help, you know, provide some of the labor and the contacts that would otherwise be really difficult for a lot of folks there to undertake on their own, and maybe bring some of that stuff home. So my role in museums there is kind of trying to think about how we can have a different way of doing this kind of research that doesn't involve, you know, the lone researcher narrative and the fragmentation of collections across different museums. I'm going back through some of the archives, and you know, you see this original correspondence that he had. This was a letter that he actually wrote, you know, to the then colonial governor. And you know, basically, again, you kind of got this narrative of like this lone explorer, lone discoverer, and he's saying, you know, as far as you can guess at what we shall find in Nyasaland, but as far as actual collections are concerned, the country is virtually a closed book. So this, I mean, to some people, this feels exciting, like, oh, wow, there's just like this, you know, terra incognita. This is this area we don't know anything about. But on the other hand, I think it's important to point out that these places are not closed books to the people who live there. And they have never been closed books to the people who live there. They might have things that are there that they don't necessarily have a lot of information about, or that they've never studied themselves in the same way that other people might study them, but that doesn't mean that they don't know that it's a closed book. They don't know what's going on in their own backyards. And my own kind of, I guess, journey as an academic has been kind of growing up, I suppose, coming up and through my PhD under that kind of idea of the lone explorer, and then just spending more time talking to folks and asking them what it is that they find interesting about what it is that I find interesting, if anything, right? And then finding out that often there's this really big disconnect. You know, the researchers come in from somewhere else. They've got some folks that are maybe local on their team, but when we say local, we mean like probably from the capital city somewhere. They've never met them. They don't know them. They're not from the community, right? That would be like bringing someone from Washington, you know, up here and saying, okay, here's a local, because they're American, right? And no one knows them, and they've never been here before. It's kind of like that. So instead, just thinking about like the number of nights that I've sat around the campfire, because you're in the field for a long time, and just kind of asking people, what do you think about what we're doing here? And most of the time their answer is like, well, it's interesting. And I say, well, why is it interesting? And they're like, well, we should know something about our history. And I said, well, don't you know something about your history? And they're like, well, yeah, I do. Of course I do. But, you know, no one has ever bothered to ask them about their own history. They just kind of come in assuming that we're going to be the ones who are going to inform them, which is a pretty, I guess, narcissistic way of thinking about science. So I'm trying to overcome my own biases as I go and just learn more from the people who I'm working with. And again, here's that like anthropogenic landscape, right? You got all these, you know, beautiful natural landscapes, but then there's all these communities here. You can't really see them that well, but there's a road and, you know, there's little villages everywhere. So I guess that's why my title of my talk is sort of Just Ask, because it's this very basic thing. Like I've just found over the years that if we just ask folks, they're usually really happy and interested to tell us what they know. And, you know, that has tended to shift the research I've been doing in terms of the actual research questions I'm asking. I come in there with a bunch of research questions about this, and I leave with different ones because of the information that the people there have told me and the things that they would like to know that are interesting to them. So I'll just have a couple more slides and then we'll go into like, basically like, you can ask me anything. But this is a map of Africa with some sites on it, and you don't have to follow anything about these sites. What I want you to notice is that if these are archaeological sites that were known like around the year 2000, you probably see there's some parts of Africa that are a little more well studied than others, right? This is not all the archaeological sites in Africa. This is impossible. Africa was the home of humankind as long as humans have been human. But it is also, not a place that has received as much research attention from this perspective, from this like outside kind of scientific perspective. And so it looks like there's not that many sites, but these are the ones that are specifically useful for understanding something about like that period of time when humans looked human and were starting to transition into also something that acted human, I suppose, if that's a way I can describe it. So they were people, but they maybe didn't have the same like really intense development of like the social interactions that humans have today. Or I don't know how I can explain this a little bit more without all the background. I'm trying to be like not too technical and jargony. Let me think. Basically, when you go through kind of like the story of humanity, you see that you have the first fossils that look like human fossils at like 300,000 years ago. So that's a really long time ago. But then you got to skip forward like to 100,000 years ago, which is still a long time ago, right? But also quite a long time after that first appearance of modern looking people, before you start to see in the archaeological record things like jewelry. Okay, so like people actually symbolically expressing themselves. That comes much later after people looked like people. So that transition is what was really interesting to me. It's like, when did we actually have clearly the physical capacity to do all these complex, innovative things and make complicated tools and all of that? But we didn't really start to do it until a lot later in our history. And like, why would that be the case? And so that's kind of the question period that I was interested in. And these are the sites that are most relevant to understanding that at that time. Anyway, the point is, and this is kind of related to this kind of paper that I'm referencing here called Homo symbolicus. So it's like, we don't know if those early people that look like people had language, if they had spoken language, because language doesn't fossilize. We just know that they had big brains, because that brain shape can fossilize, right? You can see the size of their head in the fossil. So we know they've got a big brain, and we don't know if they use language or not with that big brain. But we also know that spoken language is one of the most important human adaptations that we have, because it allows us to symbolically communicate so much information, like to our neighbors. Don't go over that hill because there's something there that's going to eat you, right? It's something valuable that we can communicate using symbolic spoken language that like other animals just can't do. We can talk about future events and plan them out so that they go over, a little bit better. We can talk about past events so that we can build on the knowledge of our ancestors. And then the next generation doesn't have to just relearn everything from the start. And that's all because of language. So that question of like, when did we actually start to use language is a really interesting question about like what it means to be human and what it is that gave us all these advantages that we clearly have other organisms, because we have sort of taken over the planet. So Homo symbolicus, I guess, was my main interest. And a lot of those key sites are along the South African coast. So I was working down there. And then you can see that there's a huge research bias on the rest of the continent, right? There's some folks who work up in the Rift, but for the most part, it's a closed book to researchers like us. And so the question is, how can we open that book that already exists for the people who are living there and access it in a way that is meaningful to them as well? So, all right, getting off track here. How did I do this? I went on a road trip. So I was living down here in Cape Town. I was a grad student. I thought I could do anything, just anything. I had no children at that time. I was totally unconstrained. And then I drove to the Serengeti, where I did an archaeological excavation up there, which was amazing. And then on the way back, as I was driving through, we went through this little country of Malawi. And I never really paid much attention to it because, as you can see, it doesn't appear on the map of archaeological sites that are of the time period of interest to me. And this is what we saw, right? So we just crossed the border, and I can go back and show you where we are. See this, it's maybe not that obvious, but this is a lake, right? It's a massive, massive lake. And that's what it looks like when you're standing there looking at it. And it's like, it's just indescribably beautiful. And it's also, you know, an economic anchor point for the region because of all of the people who depend on it for, you know, for their livelihoods. So we went there, we see this lake, and we were like, wow, this is something else. You know, this was really stunning and unexpected because we didn't really know what a giant lake like that would look like in the tropics. Then we drove, and we were driving, and we drove through all this kind of territory and all this kind of vegetation. This was pretty interesting and different. And then we ended up really high up on this plateau where there's these extensive grasslands full of things like zebra and all sorts of other grazing animals. And actually at that time, they still allowed you to do these like horseback safaris. So you're like on a horse in the middle of all of this, which was pretty amazing. They've since stopped that. I don't know why. They did, but I think maybe the horses were just too expensive to keep up there, honestly, because it takes like a day and a half to get there. But we were just really blown away by how beautiful it was. And I'll be honest, the reason I'm working in Malawi most of the time now, and I focused my career on that for the last 15 years, is basically because I just really like the place. And I came across the border from Tanzania, and it was like crazy. It was just loud, and there were these people, and they're banging on the windows, and they were like, you know, because they want money from you, basically. They're like, all right, tourists, let's get the money before they cross the border. So they're like, we'll sell you this, we'll get you this, we'll be your agent, we'll have, you know, and it's just like this noise. And you go over the border into Malawi, and there was just like this really peaceful, singular person sitting there on a chair, and he was like, welcome. And that's actually their motto. They call themselves, their sort of big tourism thing is the warm heart of Africa. And they pride themselves on that at a national level, that they are a welcoming place. And I found that to be very much true. I mean, there's a lot of diversity in the people who live there. There's a lot of different languages that are spoken, a lot of different ethnic groups, but nationally, they really do feel like, as I've moved throughout the country, I still hear it from everyone, you know, we're the warm heart of Africa, we're the warm heart of Africa. So it means something to people to be that. Here I am up there in 2005. It was very cold, very, very cold up there. I was uncomfortable. I think I had like an infected foot or something from some, I don't know, accident in the beautiful lake. But basically I was kind of like, this is stunning, but I need to move on. And the thing is, as I moved on, it just stayed with me. Like it sat at the back of my head. I got to go back there. I got to go back. I got to do something there. What kind of research could I do in this part of Africa that's different from where everyone, you know, my other colleagues were all working in South Africa? So in 11 years later, and I'm just fast forwarding here, we went back to that exact same place, that exact same site, and we discovered some of the oldest ancient human DNA in all of Africa. And the reason that we did that was because I was so cold when I was there that I was sitting in a conference and I was hearing people going, oh, we'll never get ancient human DNA from Africa. It's only going to be European DNA because it's cold in Europe and it's hot in Africa. And I was like, it is not hot. Because it's got a lot of, you know, variation. Africa's a big place and there's a lot of mountains. And it's, as we know, you go up, you get cold. So I was like, if we're going to have a natural refrigerator up there, there might be some ancient DNA preserved up there. And we went to check it out and we found that that was true. So we made the New York Times. That was exciting. And then in 2022, we went back again with Diendo Masalani, who just joined the Yale School of Medicine. And he's got an ancient DNA lab. And we're trying to see if we can even get like ancient DNA from just the dirt itself that's there. So no grinding up human remains, no sampling anything that's sensitive, but just basically looking at tubes of dirt to see if they have some sort of remnant of human DNA in them. So that's kind of some of the stuff we're working on now. And then what you can do is basically ask me anything about what I just talked about. Or you can pick a theme, and I've got slides that I can fast forward to kind of support any of these themes. And I was thinking things that might be of interest in this particular forum would be, I mean, there's research results, which I'm happy to talk about. Most of my talks are about research results. So what have we found? A lot of times people just ask me questions about fieldwork, which is its own unique experience. And we can go on a tangent there if you want. We can talk about other things that Yale is doing actually that sort of grew from this unexpectedly. And then if you want to, we could talk more about the community aspect of it. So I guess I'll just leave it to the audience to pick a theme or to give me any questions they might have about what I just did. Yeah.
Does Asia weigh in at all on our origins, or is it completely Africa?
Asia weighs in an interesting way because there's like, we talk about human origins, we could actually be talking about a number of different points in time. So if we're talking about like the deepest origins, it's always Africa. So the very first fossil record of any human or human relative that is outside of Africa is going to be 1.8 million years ago. And that's in this site in Dmanisi, which is in Georgia, not like Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, but like, you know, Georgia in Europe. And then you have a bunch of other sites after that. And this is like Homo erectus. So this is pre-human, still pre-human. And then what looks like happened is that, you know, there continue to be expansions of those Homo erectus populations, and they continue to evolve and do their thing. And they were pretty technologically sophisticated. They made axes, stone axes, and that sort of thing. But their brains were smaller than ours. And you don't see any evidence for symbolic behavior that might indicate language. So we don't think they had spoken language. But back in Africa, we also continue to evolve from Homo erectus. And then that eventually was the population that led to modern humans, which then secondarily expanded out of Africa, where they found all these other, you know, remnants of populations from that earlier Homo erectus group still hanging out there and still living there. And the first thing we did was replace them. So replace is a soft word for basically we eradicated them, essentially. I mean, we see very clearly in the record that as soon as modern humans show up anywhere, there's like a very rapid decline of whatever population is already there. And that's true even for really, really close relatives like Neanderthals in Europe. So there was some interbreeding, a little bit of admixture there, but for the most part, it was like a kind of a little bit of a genetic takeover. Yeah.
Are those fire-making tools in the lower right?
These are beads. And so these are beads made out of the shells of ostriches, ostrich eggs, not ostrich bones, but, and then these are beads that are made out of the shells of like these giant land snails that sometimes people illegally import as pets, but they're huge snails and they make, they have a really strong shell and you can make ornaments. Yeah.
Since we're in the Peabody, what are your views on the colonials in museums?
Well, I actually ripped a lot of these slides off of a previous talk I gave on that very topic. If you'll remember, you've seen some of this before. Because I think two things, and one of them is a little heretical maybe, which is that I think it's important and I think it matters. We have to move beyond and acknowledge that a lot of the museum collections globally come from exploitive practices. And they are not necessarily serving any of the communities of origin in many cases. So we have to acknowledge that, we have to do better about that, and we have to invest resources in that. On the other hand, and here's the heretical part, we don't want to get caught up in saying decolonizing without doing decolonizing, right? We need to actually walk the walk. This was something that bothered me a little bit about my own work because I felt strongly that, you know, there were practices in the past I'd like to move beyond, but I kind of didn't know how to do that in a practical sense, you know? So I could say the words, but I wasn't sure how to do the actions. And a little bit recently, I've been thinking about and asking people what would help you. And it's just the obvious thing. It's like, why don't we just ask the people who are affected by this, what they want to see? Now, a surprising or maybe not so surprising answer I usually get is, I just want a bridge for my community. I want a school. We want a school. Or sometimes they want a local heritage center. What people want is they want to be able to appreciate their own heritage in their own way. And they have been stripped of all the resources because of historical reasons that might be able to get them there. So if we say, well, you should want a museum, or you should want this, or, you know, you should want knowledge, or I'll come give a lecture. That's all fine to do those things, but it's not necessarily what people actually want. So I've just found that if you just ask people, they'll tell you. And what we need to do, I think, in science, if we really do want to decolonize this history, is we need to start thinking about, you know, ways to get resources to do those things into those communities. Because otherwise we're just continuing a cycle of self service. Yeah.
If you wasn't doing this, what you're doing now, what you're talking about now, what would you wanted to do?
Like in my life? Oh man, I want to do everything. I want to have 5 lives where I get to do 5 things. Because what's really cool about this is I kind of get to do a little bit of everything. The people part of it is fun and interesting and useful, and I feel like I learn a lot, but also just like academically, I get to do a little bit of biology and a little bit of geology and a little bit of ecology and a little bit of, you know, so it's sort of because it's in the service of some question about human behavior or human origins, even psychology, brain science, right? I get to consume little pieces of all of it, which makes me a little bit of a master of nothing. but I have a lot of fun every day, because whatever research question I'm digging into is the most interesting question of that day. And then the next day it might be a different kind of thing. Now, when you look at the way that universities like to see your research identity, that's a little disjointed sometimes, but I have a lot of fun doing it. And so I'm not really answering your question definitively, because, you know, when I was a kid, okay, let me tell you this. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an author. How about that? I wanted
You're doing it now.
I wanted to write. And I realized a couple years ago, I actually ended up being an author, just in a strange way. But I would love to do something that's a little more public facing, I suppose, with writing. So I'm trying to write up more of the stuff as like opinions and things like that, which satisfies a piece of that. But is that a good answer?
Thank you. That's your answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding communication.
Yep.
In terms of the timeframes, periods that you dealt with, as far as the different civilizations pictorially communicating or capturing a historic kind of thing, or expressing relationship to God, or picturing God, what kind of communication in terms of picturing, drawings that might have been evident in the time frames that you're dealing with in terms of the historical perspective, and that being a basis for communication?
So thinking about using images to convey to folks. Yeah. A project we're working on now is there's an anthropological filmographer. Basically, he's a film studies professor at the University of Malawi. He has an interest in anthropology. So I'm very lucky to have found him in the last few years. We're trying to put together a series of like 5-minute videos, just 5 minutes long, on some topic. Like, it's a huge series of topics, but each one only 5 minutes. And it'll be things like images, you know, so it'll have people talking over, or it'll show people working with materials. Like, this is, for example, what is a stone tool? Might be one topic, you know, and then it will be images of people manipulating them. This is how they made, here's how they're used, because it's really hard to conceptualize that if you don't actually see the process happening. The problem with that, and we want all those videos to be local people, local languages. So this is not me standing there going, here's how you make a stone tool, but this has got to be something that feels relatable to folks and that comes from the community as well. and in their words that they would use to describe what is a stone tool, to other people who they know. And the obstacle is that a lot of these communities don't have power. So how are we going to show them these videos? Well, a lot more people are getting smartphones, so they might be able to watch them on there. And then they've got solar panels to get the power. But we've got this kind of plan that we're cooking up to have a motorbike with a bunch of spare batteries and a portable projector. And then out into the villages go, a team of like 3 people who are including this professor from the University of Malawi or his students. And then trying to help kind of show these in community forums where people can ask questions and it's a little more interactive. So we're trying to use images that way. When conveying things like the span of time, the huge span of time that we're talking about, that's hard for anybody to grasp. I throw out words like 300,000. It's kind of meaningless, honestly. Even when I deal with this on a daily basis, it's still, yesterday I had an Excel file and I had like the last 20,000 years on it. And I was putting in all the details about it. And then I'm like, oh, I got to expand the record back another 10,000. And I'm like, oh, that's a lot of cells. It just keeps going. And then I had that moment where I was like, wow, when we talk about these time periods so casually, they're really long and a lot can happen. So what I've done before is I've had people walk it, so like you can say, all right, every step we take is a generation. Let's go. That's a long time. And people can kind of get a sense of it. That can be helpful. But it's a hard thing to convey, honestly. And there was a symposium here that was organized by Veronica Weberu, who is a professor in linguistics. And she organized, it was called Genesis Epistemology. So it was about like, how can we reconcile different ways of thinking about the origins of humans, and specifically in ways that actually resonate with folks who are from the places that science says is the origin of humans. What's the understanding locally of where we came from, what the meaning is behind that. That was a really interesting symposium. She had people from all over Africa come to Yale to talk about their areas of expertise.
Yes, good night. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. Well, actually a 2-part question that's in the chat.
Sure.
What opportunities are there for young people to sample your field? And does the Peabody or the anthropology department have experiences for kids?
Experiences for kids. So young people. Well, when you said young people, I'm thinking about like 18-year-olds. Maybe not. Yes. Okay. So with the kids question, I think that's more of a question for, because I've had high school students come and like do internships and summer research volunteering in my lab. But I think if we're thinking younger than that, there's many, many layers of permissions basically and trainings that you have to do to make sure you're working with much younger audiences. I don't do a lot of that work. I'll be honest. Most of the younger audiences I work with are my 3 kids. I don't want to hear it. So, but I know that Peabody has a lot of that programming, and we have an expert right here who can talk about it.
I could just say very briefly that the education department is working on a lot of programming for different audiences. We have high school students who work in the galleries, teaching hands-on with materials to younger kids. We're doing programs for families and young children. We are doing special events for various ages. Programs for adults and adult learners now, including art classes. So we are looking for a variety of ways to reach people of all different ages and interests to do different programming. And I'm always welcoming new ideas for programs.
Okay, so we can direct people to the website and to your email address?
Do peabody.education@yale.edu.
Okay, thank you.
And just there was a question back here I want to make sure we get to.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted a question related to his question. How much time elapsed between the discovery of spoken language and written language?
Oh, right. Great question. Well, first we'd have to know when they started, which is, believe it or not, still something that people are really interested in knowing more about, because spoken language is a hard thing to find. And written language might have been written down on stuff that doesn't preserve, long before it ever got written down on something that does preserve. So finding what we can say is the minimum age. And I would say that the minimum age by which we had spoken language is probably indicated by all these symbolic artifacts, because you need to be able to talk about them for them to have meaning. Otherwise, there isn't another species that decorates itself with beads, colors them, wears them in a particular configuration, and then shows up next to another one. And the other one doesn't pay any attention to what it is that they smell like, the way like other animals do, but they're looking at the beads. They want to know what the cultural identity is and the ethnic identity. And then when they talk, all the different ethno-linguistic identities reinforce that. So I think it's wrapped up in like the physical manifestation of language has got to have something to do with ornaments and evidence of symbolic information transfer. And that would be, depending how you define it, but it would be at least 120,000 years ago. I think irrefutably, nobody would argue with that one. Most folks would probably say there was some form of spoken communication at the origin of humans and probably before, even with Homo erectus, but how symbolic that was and how much they were able to convey concepts of like time and before and after, it's hard to know. But when you see those ornaments show up 120,000 years ago, that's clearly it's there. Written language, the earliest evidence, this is now too young for my, is there any expert in here? No, I think it's about 8,000 years ago. I know it's in the early Holocene, so it's a lot later. There's recently been some interesting research, which is in my time period of where I know more about, where they like look at rock paintings that people made a long time ago, sometimes 25,000 years ago. And clearly that's conveying some sort of symbolic information. But sometimes they're like these little marks or dots, or sometimes you'll find like a bone with some carvings on it and it's just lines. And people think that's probably like maybe lunar cycles or tallies of events, but it could also be communicating, in some cases, some sort of symbolic information beyond that. And if so, then that might be considered written language. It just depends on your definition of it. But it was a lot later. People were talking a long time before they read, just like kids. The question back there?
So would the symbolism help us understand the religiosity of the folk back then?
Potentially. Yeah, potentially. It depends on what it is that the symbolism tells us there was some sort of personal identity or group identity, like a shared group identity. Like you got to know what that means in order to be able to speak the same language. And that's true whether you're speaking spoken language or if you're speaking unspoken communication through symbolism, like what I'm wearing, right? That can indicate a lot to somebody. And we pick up these cues so quickly, and we do it from such a tiny, tiny age that it's clearly in our genes to be able to do that. It's been important to our evolution to have that capacity to pick up on those things. So at which point that manifested as ways of thinking about the world abstractly is probably connected, but really hard to know until you actually have something figurative to look at. You know what I mean? So like a drawing of this that shows up repeatedly, or a carving of this that shows up repeatedly. And when it comes to that, we're really constrained by how much stuff preserves, because beautiful paintings, beautiful basketry, beautiful textiles, all that's not going to preserve early on. And that's probably where a lot of that information was encoded. So again, you're probably going to be seeing this stuff, evidence for it, way, way, way after it actually started to come about.
Do you have time for one more question?
Someone else choose for me? You had your hand up before, I think. And
Let's do
can I do
two.
a couple more? I
Yes.
saw there were
Yep.
3.
No, it just occurred to me that, we have it right here, even though I love Africa and I've lived and studied in Africa for a number of years. But, when the Europeans invaded North America, there were about 100 million Native Americans living here. And we did a big job on replacing them, so to speak, if I can use your word, but they're actually still here. And they're substantially unstudied in many respects. And just right here, half of the names of the places that we're here in Connecticut. the words, the language, the sites are present right here. So I just wanted to raise that up as, now, even though we're probably only talking about human being here for maybe 20 to 30,000 years in North America, but I just think that the indigenous people of North America are having a moment where there's a lot more acknowledgement happening, but all of the same issues that you're talking about with the local people in Africa would hold true for many of the groups that are still here and are trying to recover their own heritage. So just wanted to put in a plug for.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are finally listening, starting to listen at the institutional level to the voices of people who've been trying to get someone to listen for a long time. And so that's happening globally, and it's all connected. You're right, it's all connected. And it's even connected to my own personal life because I wrote an op-ed on this, so it's not like a secret. It was in the Hartford Current, I think, but it was about my street name is a term that was recently considered, recently officially designated as derogatory.
I know where you live.
At the federal level.
Yes.
And when we moved there, we were like, this is finally the house we want. Why? Why does it have to have this street name? And then, a couple of years later, they actually designated this as like a racist term, basically on at the federal level, but at the state and the local level, you can name things whatever you want to name them. So for a while, I was like, all right, I should fight this. I live on the street. That means I'm in a position where I can actually fight this. And then it was with respect to indigenous people. And then I kind of started down that path. I put an inquiry in, first selectman, and then I went, hang on. Have I actually asked anybody locally what they think? And it was that same principle that I had learned just kind of through conversations with people in my research that helped me give me some pause and say, maybe there are other priorities and other places that folks would want me to put my energy if I was to just ask them. So I put that on hold, and I'm now trying to find the time basically to just like talk to people and ask them, well, what would you like? And the reason is because that term is definitely derogatory as it was applied moving west. But in this particular area, it derives from Algonquian speaking people vocabulary. And so there is a little bit of tension about if it's actually appropriate to use it in certain regional contexts, or if it's like just broadly not, right? And so it's complicated. In other words, it's complicated. And this kind of work is all connected and has informed like my personal life. And I think we had anyone pressing question? I see there's one question there, but I know there were other.
Yeah.
There was someone in the corner there. I don't know if you saw the question.
Oh, it was about the unexpected Yale connections. I wanted to ask, what is your most meaningful or surprising Yale connection that you didn't expect?
Oh, this was very cool. Okay, so I'll describe this photo that I took. This photo, it was amazing. I was like hanging out in the bleachers and they said, get down here with your camera and take a photo. So I did. And so this is the one of the 7 paramount chiefs of Malawi. So there are 7 of them that are kind of in charge of each of their own ethnic groups. And he is the 5th in line from somebody who was actually a part of the original Zulu diaspora. So if you've heard of Shaka Zulu in South Africa, I got to show you this picture because I have to. Sorry, I'm going to go all the way through this. Okay, here. Zulu Kingdom is here. And basically, with all of the disruption of the British Zulu Wars and then the Zulu takeover of local adjacent communities, there were a number of people that dispersed out all the way across. And one of them moved this way and ended up actually in Malawi. And just to give you a sense of scale of how big that is, right? When you actually scale it, this is how far these folks walked. And these are the people who live in that area now today. And in that picture, that is the king who was the descendant of the original person who founded that group and moved out. So his name is Nkosi Yamakosi, which means King of Kings, Mbewa 5, because he's the 5th in line. And so I've been attending these festivals just because we happen to be in the area, but they're not actually in my time period of interest. This is like real history, not ancient history. And I kind of didn't really pay that much attention to it, but then in talking to people, I found that this is a really, probably the most meaningful aspect of their cultural lives is this identity. And we're finding objects and artifacts that probably have something to do with it, like these tiny little beads, these glass beads that we find at archaeological sites, and they're like right at the top. So I'm like, oh, that's not human evolution stuff. But actually, it's turns out that's the most interesting material to anyone who lives there because it's part of their heritage that they understand and connect with immediately. And so we're holding some workshops and, like I said, walking the walk, trying to invite folks in to actually view where the collections are held and see and know that they are actually accessible to them if they want to. And then, you know, this is James Green, who's at the Yale Art Gallery. And we went to that festival. Here I am giving a gift to the king, who's very cool. He always wears the sunglasses. And, you know, this is that mountain again that I showed you at the beginning. So they hold this festival every year at the bottom of this mountain. And they're going to do an exhibit now on that diaspora here at Yale. Because I suggested it. I'm so excited. So anyway, I think that's it.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. Okay, so you know what, if you have any outstanding questions, please come up and talk to Dr. Thompson. She'll be happy to answer them. I want to thank you all for coming today. And I also want to thank the Peabody staff for coming in at the crack of dawn to host us. So make sure you thank them when you're walking around. Andrea, again, I'll point her out, is happy to lead you through the first floor if you'd like a tour. And our next breakfast will be on February 6th at 101 Ashman Street. It's going to feature Dean Jose Garcia Leon, who is the Dean of the Music School of Music. They do a lot of things throughout New Haven, so please join us.
Aaron, one quick thing. Andrew, you want to say what's going to happen for MLK just super quick?
Yes, please join us on January 20th. Our celebration of Dr. King at the Peabody Museum will happen all day long with an environmental justice focus. Everyone's invited. Please join us. And if you would like to stick around and walk through the galleries with us, let's take 3 minutes to finish your coffee or take a bathroom break just around this corner. I'm gonna look to Madison to tell us what to do about parking. And we'll take maybe 20 minutes to walk through the first floor, look at the history of the earth. And if Jess, you have time to stick around, we will end in the gallery that Dr. Thompson designed and talk a little more about human origins.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zoom people. We'll see you next month.